Hello YouTube, got another video for you. This one is a fan requested video specifically dealing with the topic of economic and political collapse, how that works, how to make that happen in Axis and Allies 1914. Before I get into that, though, I do need to make a personal plug. This is something totally unrelated to Axis and Allies and strategy games, but I am pleased to announce that I just recently published my first book. Over here we have it in the North and South Atlantic. It is entitled Cosmic Fate. It is a science fiction story. If you think about some of the main science fiction worlds out there, you know, your Star Trek and your Star Wars, humans basically run everything. I mean, you might have your token alien sidekick or your token alien leader just so you can say, oh look, they're aliens, but humans basically run everything. A recent example of that is the movie Rogue One, which I was fortunate enough to see last weekend. I did enjoy the movie, nothing wrong with it. I did very much enjoy it, but it's just another example. You know, humans basically run everything. But I thought to myself, in prepping for this novel, what if that were not the case? What if mankind were expanding out into the galaxy and discovered that already existing is a long-standing alien society? You know, multiple aliens learning to live together, perhaps some better than others. But what if that was already well established, and instead of humans being on the inside, being the leaders, humans are the on the outside, the unrefined, the barbarians at the gate, so to speak, trying to get in? What would that kind of world look like? And so that is what I try to illustrate. That is the background to Cosmic Fate. And then the story itself follows two Alliance officers. You might, think of them as military personnel, as they get unwittingly dragged into a game of political intrigue and espionage and subterfuge by forces working behind the shadows, forces that are trying to seize for themselves an ancient power that they cannot truly fathom when it comes down to it, and the consequences that has for those shadowy figures, for our main characters, and for the galaxy as a whole. So that is Cosmic Fate. Like I said, it is recently published. I have some copies on hand that I can sell. Of course, that isn't going to help many of you, but if you are in the central Illinois area, I'd be more than happy to sign a copy for you and deliver it to wherever you might be, or meet you up at a store somewhere. But for the rest of you who are not going to be in central Illinois anytime in the near future, this book is available, if it's something you're interested in, on Amazon.com. So I hope that that science fiction is something you're interested in. If not, just ignore this part of the video, because now we're going to move back to Axis and Allies. Let me go ahead and get these guys off the board here. We'll just put them off to the side, and there we go. So the topic of this video is going to be economic and political collapse. What is that? Well, ultimately, when you take enough territories, or really it's enough production, away from one of your enemies. So let's say for the Allies, maybe you're going after the Ottomans. That's something I've talked a lot about in some of my other videos. If you either take or contest enough of their production so that the Ottomans are no longer able to count on it, they will either go into economic or political collapse. Economic collapse means that they are no longer able to collect money, and they are no longer able to spend the money that they have. It is not the same as other versions of Axis and Allies, where when you take an enemy capital, their money on hand passes to whoever took the capital. In Axis and Allies 1914, in economic collapse, the country that has collapsed does still retain any money it has on hand. It just is not able to spend it. Now, I have seen different versions of this rule. Some say that economic and political collapse both occur, or that you check for them at the beginning of the country's turn. So as soon as it's the Ottomans' turn, before they do anything, they check to see if they're in economic or political collapse, and the effects happen immediately. I've seen other variants that say economic collapse occurs just as I described at the beginning of the turn, but political collapse is a little bit different. Now, political collapse requires a higher threshold, and we'll get to what those thresholds are for each country in just a couple minutes. But political collapse, the consequence, whenever it is triggered, so whenever you're checking, if a country is in political collapse, all of their units are removed from the game. They are effectively eliminated. This means that any of their territories that were contested immediately pass to the hostile enemy who was contesting them, and any territories not contested are now empty. So essentially the first country to move in there is going to get their production. Now, let's say that, let's use a different example. Let's say that Italy is under political collapse. So Italy is eliminated. Then if France moves units into Italy, France can secure that production then goes to France. But at the same time, if the Austrians, let's say, were to move units in, there's nothing to stop them. Everybody who can is just going to try and gobble up that country as quickly as possible. Now, I have seen, when it comes to political collapse, I have seen tournament rules that say, well, you also do that at the beginning of the turn, which makes it a lot more potent, a lot easier to knock people out. I've also seen variants that say, check this at the end of the turn. Now, the advantage to the person being attacked is that on their turn, they could still use their units. So let's say the Ottomans are in political collapse, but on their turn, let's say they might use their units to, uncontest or get sole control over a territory that was contested, or seize back a territory that was solely in enemy hands. So at the end of their turn, they no longer meet the political collapse threshold. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to put people into political collapse if you do it at the end of the turn. Given how easily it can be done, potentially against the Ottomans especially, I would tend to favor doing political collapse at the end of the turn. I don't think that it is particularly, it would be particularly fun, especially for the Ottomans, because there's not a whole lot they can do if you do it, especially with political collapse, but to a certain degree with economic if you do it at the beginning of the turn. I think it'll help keep things balanced, keep things that are kind of absurd from happening if you do it at the end of the turn. That's just my personal preference. I know in some of my earlier videos I was going off of the political and economic collapse at the beginning of the turn, so there are variants like that, but in retrospect I think doing political at the end makes more sense. Now, every country on the board can technically hit economic collapse or political collapse. Now, I wouldn't make an exception in the case of the United States, only because the United States only has one territory, so if it's contested or captured, that's pretty much it for the United States. So technically, it should be able to economic or political collapse, but in reality, trying to come up with different thresholds really makes no sense, because they either have that territory or they don't. So let's not worry about that, let's worry about everybody else. Now, economic collapse or political collapse, like I said, has to do with the production that is either in enemy hands or contested, your production that you cannot collect. Furthermore, this only applies to your core production. What does that mean? Well, it means that we don't have to worry about anything in Africa that's considered colonial, that is not core. Anything can happen in Africa and it will have no impact on political or economic thresholds. Core territories, you can think about it this way. So let's say France, for example. You want to look at the capital. Any territory that is land connected, even if it's maybe not adjacent, let's say Lorraine here, is still connected by land to the capital, that is a core territory. England just has, the British Isles up here are connected, and that will come into play when it comes to their thresholds. We'll get to that later. Same with Italy. Anything in the boot is considered core. Libya is not. Neither is Somaliland over here. Austria has no colonies, so pretty much everything Austrian counts. Russia, also totally landlocked, no colonies, don't have to worry about that. Neutrals that lean one way or the other also do not count. It is just your starting territories. And then in the case of the Ottomans, of course, they also have no colonies. Bulgaria doesn't count, so they have just that. India, also, my understanding is that India would not count, even though you can produce from there. It does not fulfill the land connected to the capital territory rule. So now, what are the thresholds? Because it does vary per country. And while I have seen variance in terms of when political collapse should be calculated, the thresholds that I have seen pretty much match regardless of which tournament variant I have looked at. When it comes to the Austrians, if 13 production is either in enemy hands or contested, or a combination of those two things, they are in economic collapse, 13 or more production. If they hit 16 or more production, they are in political collapse, whenever you want to trigger that. Russia is 13 and 15. Why political is slightly different, I'm not totally sure. Maybe because of the historical Russian Revolution, they wanted to make it slightly easier for them to be knocked out. When it comes to Germany, you're looking at 16 for economic, 18 for political, which seems like a lot, but if you look at their border territories, you've got 3 and 3 over there, 6 and 3 over there, so they've got some very highly concentrated production here. Austria is kind of in that same boat. Russia is more spread out. I don't know if that came into play also when they were doing those thresholds, but it's possible. When we look at France, we're looking at 8 for economic, 10 for political. So if every border territory in France is captured or contested by the Central Powers, it would be an economic collapse. It still would not be in political because that is only 8 production. The Central Powers would have to take something else, anything else, or contest anything else in order to cause that to happen. So if the question is, well, what about taking the capital? In this case, if, let's say, Germany were to take all of this, they would still either have to sneak into Bordeaux, in which case France just has this and they probably should collapse, I mean, if we're being realistic, or Paris is going to be contested, in which case they would be in political collapse either way. So by the time a country is virtually getting overrun, that is normally the point where you're going to meet that political collapse threshold. Maybe not quite as much with economic, because the threshold isn't as high, but you're still going to be in fairly poor condition. It's not really something that, unless you're completely not paying attention, your enemies are just going to sneak in and be like, oh, now you're in economic collapse, and you had no idea. You thought you were doing pretty well. Next, we've got the British Empire. Now, the British Empire, despite their high production, actually has low thresholds, and that's because a lot of their production is spread out throughout the world, and when it comes to their core territories, there's not a whole lot to work with. And when you think about the fact that if England itself were invaded and the enemy gained a foothold, like a strong foothold on the island, that would be devastating. So think about, it's the same type of thing. If that were to happen in this game, the enemies of England wouldn't have to take a ton in order for things to just kind of collapse. For England, the economic threshold is 5 production, so meet or exceed 5 for economic collapse, 7 for political. So that means basically everything except London, or London and any one other territory to force that to happen. Now let's move down to the Ottomans over here. The Ottomans have an economic threshold of 7, political of 9, which means kind kind of like England, their capital and anything, or well, not Bulgaria, yeah, their capital and any of their other cores is going to put them in economic collapse. It is possible to put them in political collapse without taking their capital, but you pretty much have to take, it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You basically have to take pretty much everything. Yeah, by my count, unless I'm miscalculating here really quick, you pretty much have to take or contest everything aside from their capital if you want to, you know, force them into political collapse without doing it. Or you take their capital and the right other territory, maybe Ankara is worth 3, that puts you at 9, that would do it. Or their capital and something that is worth less, you'd need 2 things that are less than 3. So their capital plus 2 of their weaker territories, or their capital and 1 of their other decent territories over here in order to make that happen. And finally, we've got Italy. Italy has the same thresholds as the Ottomans, 7 and 9. So if you're trying to knock out Italy, you pretty much have to come down this way anyway. This is going to put you at 6. This is going to put you at 7. So if the Central Powers control these 3 territories, Italy is already in pretty bad shape because it means both Rome and Naples are threatened. That is going to be enough to put it in economic collapse, but not political collapse. So in order to put it in political collapse, you'd either have to, as the Central Powers, take Rome, in which case, of course, that's really bad for Italy, or Naples, which is pretty much all their core territories, except for Rome. In either case, if we think realistically, this would put Italy in extremely bad condition. It makes sense that if they're in that type of position, they probably should be eliminated from the game rather than be able to hold out when faced with a similar situation. Even those most diehard Italian nationalists would not be able to continue fighting on. They'd have to resort to basically guerrilla tactics and would cease to be a country at that point. So that is how the economic and political rules apply, at least in terms of the thresholds. Like I said, sometimes you have that little variant when it comes to when these things need to be calculated. But if you're playing tournament rules, that is something that I strongly recommend you review, because that could impact your strategy, things that you might not do because they would not lead to a total overrun of a country, or they might lead to you getting bogged down in an invasion. If they're able to get you enough production, especially economic collapse, just because political is so difficult to achieve, but economic collapse, you might try to focus on doing that, because that means that while the front might get bogged down, you don't have to devote as many resources to keeping it stable or to pushing forward. So definitely this is something to keep in mind if you are playing either with friends and you want to use these economic and political collapse rules, which I strongly recommend, or if you're playing in a tournament. It's going to keep the game moving along. It helps add a little bit of realism to it, and it helps create a little variability with strategy, just because you have some additional options and additional things that you might want to factor in, you know, partially taking out an enemy rather than feeling like you need to completely destroy them at any given point. So that is my overview of that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that also that you are science fiction fans, at least some of you, and you'll consider buying my book. If you don't, no hard feelings. But like I said, I would be, given that this is, you know, a big event for me, it would almost seem inappropriate to not mention it to you guys. So again, hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment if you did, or if you have any other questions, or if you would like to see a particular video. Like I said, this is a fan requested video. Please let me know, and I will do what I can to get just such a video created in the near future.